Hey everybody, welcome back to the Taurus Route. We're going to take a look at the chart of Aiden Fucci, who was convicted of murdering 13-year-old Tristan Bailey when he was just 14 years old himself. Um, yeah, my condolences go out to the Bailey family and everybody affected by this horrible crime. Um, so I guess I'll just give the background of Aiden first a little bit. He um, had a girlfriend and sort of a best friend, and they seemed to be the two able to provide insight into what was going on in his mind. And he had talked about killing a lot, and with his girlfriend specifically, he had talked about killing multiple people and, sort of playing innocent to get away with it, and then eventually just disappearing himself, leading people to think that he just got murdered too, and then he would continue murdering somewhere else. So he had sort of developed this fantasy of murder, and yeah, unfortunately, um, started bringing that fantasy to life. Uh, One thing to note, he's got, we'll look at his chart here and we see this big stellium in Scorpio. And so, this idea of dwelling on the darker things and death and uh, being really intense, and Mars is here, making it really, really intense. Uh, the, the girl that he murdered, was just slightly more than an acquaintance. It wasn't, he didn't have a giant emotional attachment to her, which would sort of be like the typical Scorpio kind of revenge or um, some type of a situation with a very close emotional bond. This was not, and it was premeditated in that he had been fantasizing about this, even specifically using a knife out in the woods. Um, but on this particular night, it was midnight when his friend suggested inviting Tristan over, and it was more of a, taking advantage of an opportunity than anything premeditated. He didn't set up on this very specific night to meet Tristan to murder her. It just kind of happened, and I think that will be important to keep in mind as we look at the transits and what was influencing him specifically on this night. I think the larger story with him in general is that he has all this sort of dark, brooding, potentially brooding Scorpio energy, and sort of this unrealistic fantasy escapism going on with. We'll look at this further as we look at transits, but the Piscean energy over here. We don't know what time he was born, and so at midday, the moon happens to be right here, split between Taurus and Gemini, so it could be 6 degrees back this way into Taurus or 6 degrees this way into Gemini. I tend to think it's probably back here a little bit, and I'll point out why I think that as we go. But I would think he's probably a Scorpio or a Taurus moon. I'm sorry, um, but we don't know that for sure. But for starters, that would intensify this square with Saturn, which would make sense. Um, Not only with his, you know, control issues with other people when it comes to murdering people. You're talking about somebody with a lot of power and control issues, but he also had a difficult relationship with his parents. So his home life and his authority figures was at a squaring, tense relationship. And being back into Taurus a little bit, if he was born earlier in the day, would intensify that square. It would also intensify the quincunx up to uh, Pluto up there, which is itself in a trine with Saturn. And Pluto is kind of the other death and rebirth related to Scorpio, modern ruler of Scorpio, but also related to control in a similar way as Saturn is very uncomfortable not being in control. And so these two being pretty tightly conjoined by degree um, is something we'll keep note of as well. And yeah, I think that's the long and short of this. We'll take a quick look at his progress chart now. And the main thing we want to look at here is the moon, as the moon is the fastest moving through the progress chart, but we can see that the moon has just done its 2.5 year transit through Scorpio, depending on his exact time of birth. But this also leads me to him being born a little bit before noon, anyways, and maybe that moon still being back here in Scorpio and possibly in between Mars and the sun. This moon may very well be back here in his progress chart, depending on what his time of birth is. And that's another sort of leaning inkling to me that he was born before noon and his moon is in Scorpio. But yeah, all this scorpionic energy and intensity. And you can see this Mars is coming into square with Neptune, which is part of that fantasy, escapism, and death relationship. Let's take a look at the transit chart of the time of the murder, which I chose as 2:30 a.m., which must be pretty close. First, I'll look at, looking at his natal moon here and signatures, more signatures that maybe he was born before noon with the moon in Taurus. By transit, we could see that Jupiter would have a somewhat stronger, potentially square going on, but also, and maybe more importantly, this Pluto trine would be even tighter if his natal moon were back here. So there's that. I guess the main thing we want to look at with murder and violence is Mars. And we saw that Mars was up here at 10 in Scorpio in its home, very strong, very powerful next to the sun, and trine Uranus. And on this particular evening, Mars in real time was at 9.5, 10 degrees of Cancer, completing a grand trine by transit with, I guess, the whole beginning of this stellium, really. Mars, the sun, Venus, and Mercury over here to Uranus and back down to Mars. So this impulsivity of Mars and hot and dry planets in general is really being activated here. And if we look over here, we've got Uranus too at 11 degrees, making an exact sextile to itself and directly opposite this Mars-Sun conjunction. And then, we can come over here and we could see that the North Node is also at around 12 degrees, aspecting a lot of these planets too. All of these very chaotic, impulsive. And going back to remember, this was somebody who had really obsessed about killing, but really didn't have this specific night and this specific victim chosen. It was happenstance and taking advantage of an opportunity to kill this person. And so looking at how he was being influenced is really important. And then we'll also look at the moon here is in late Aries, and it's starting to complete a trine with his natal Saturn and Pluto up here. And this, the moon sort of being a planet related to impulsive nature, being in Aries, a very impulsive sign, is just one more signature of this very impulsive moment where this kid who had been sort of living in the fantasy of all this, I guess, succumbed to that fantasy and started to bring it to life. And yeah, I think this is pretty intense. And then we've got the sun also right here, the other hot and dry planet directly opposing the stellium. And there's always more. Oh, this is a big thing. As far as the fantasy goes, Neptune in Pisces conjunct his North Node, which has been happening for over the course of the whole last year. So this has been going on more long term, this fantasy, and then a lot of these other faster moving planets, along with Uranus, not quite so fast moving, all joining together to create, I guess, the imperfect storm, as it were. And again, I think he had plans of killing longer with this fantasy. So in a way, it's fortunate that he didn't plan this out very well and he got caught, because he may have any number of more victims at this point. So again, my condolences to the Bailey family, and thanks everybody for watching, and take care out there. Peace.